Okay, so we're going to be continuing with period 8, and in this video we're going to be getting into all of the other movements that were happening in the mid 20th century through the 1960s and 70s, aside from the civil rights movement. The only one I'm not going to talk about in this one is the anti-war movement, and I'll get to the anti-war movement when we wrap up with Vietnam later on. So in this video, we're going to be talking about sort of all those other disenfranchised or marginalized groups, and it's also going to be sort of their time. You know, a lot of times we think about maybe just the civil rights movement happening during this period, or perhaps maybe the women's movement along with it. But in reality, there were so many different movements and like social movement groups and activist groups that were really pushing for a lot of reform during this time. It certainly wasn't just the civil rights movement. However, we can definitely give the civil rights movement credit for a lot of the beginnings of this. Had it not been for the early action of the civil rights movement in like the 1940s and 1950s, then this probably wouldn't have happened. Because the civil rights movement and African Americans as activists are able to gain so much change, it really inspires a lot of these other groups of people, and it opens the door for them, and it makes them feel like, well, if we stand up and try to push for change, then change will actually happen. So I'm going to start with the gay liberation movement. So obviously, we haven't really talked about any type of gay lib movement before this. When we talk about women, we've talked about women pushing for reform before, but we haven't talked about gay people pushing for reform before, or any presence really of an LGBT community, and that's because it's illegal. Just being a woman wasn't going to get you arrested, so it made sense that people would try to push for reform. But pushing for reform for the LGBT community is dangerous because it's illegal. And uh, gay sexual activity was illegal in most states, and it was classified as a mental illness according to the American Medical Association. And there were other states that had various laws in place aside from making any type of like gay sex activity illegal. There were other laws. For example, in New York, selling alcohol to a gay person was illegal. You couldn't serve alcohol to anyone who seemed gay because they said that being gay was, or any, I guess, not just being gay, but like acting gay was considered to be disorderly conduct, and alcohol increased disorderly conduct. So if were a guy and you looked too femme, or if you were a girl and you looked too masculine, they would just straight up not serve you at bars, because it could get the bar in trouble. So there were a lot of illegal gay bars that sort of developed all over New York City. And the most popular gay bar in the city was a place called the Stonewall Inn. It was actually owned and operated by one of the original crime families of New York, one of those mob families, the Genovese family. And because it was an illegal bar already, it had more illegal activity happening. It wasn't just like a regular bar. It wasn't just like a regular gay bar, but it happened to be illegal. It was like, because it's already breaking the law, it was easy for the Genovese family to run under other crime rackets through it, whether it be bootleg liquor, drugs. They didn't have any running water or toilets inside, and it was also really known for prostitution. So it was also the only illegal gay bar where dancing was allowed, which is one of the things that made it really popular. It was mostly male, like 98% of the patrons that went to Stonewall were men, but it was very racially diverse within that male group. But like I said, most popular gay bar in the city, and there had been plenty of raids where they would just arrest anyone who seemed to be any man in feminine clothing or any woman in more masculine clothing straight to jail. And finally, in June of 1969, one of those raids took a turn and will eventually sort of launch this entire gay liberation movement. If you've ever wondered why Pride Month is June, this is the reason. It's because Stonewall happens in June. So June 28th, 1969, there's a raid. Police show up, say they're taking the place. Normally the employees of Stonewall knew when there was going to be a raid because they had been paying off the cops. But this was likely a raid planned by cops who weren't being paid off and could have been angry that they weren't being paid off, so they targeted the bar because of that, and were planning on like blackmailing wealthier people that they found at the bar. That was not uncommon at all. So some of the people in the bar refused to cooperate, so the cops decide to like take them outside. Some of the male cops start like groping some of the women. A crowd starts to gather outside. They're shouting gay power. They start singing "We Shall Overcome," that anthem of the civil rights movement. A cop ends up pushing a drag queen and she hit him with her purse. And then people start throwing beer bottles at the cop cars. One of the lesbians, they had to like physically drag her outside. She kept trying to escape. And a police officer ended up hitting her in the head with a baton, and she just looked at the crowd and started shouting, "Why don't you guys do something?" And when she said that, everything just exploded, and like violence erupted. Violence still inside. The police or the people inside ended up breaking the lights so the cops couldn't see anything. They used a parking meter as a battering ram to break down the front door. The people did, so they could get back inside. And the whole thing ended up just being out of control. And every major news outlet was covering this. And it was in a neighborhood, Greenwich Village, which had a really large and powerful gay community already. So it was like the people, the neighbors surrounding the bar were also gay and were like, "What's going on? Like, what's happening to our bar?" And we're coming out. And the more drama and the more racket they stirred up, the more people kept coming out. The Stonewall eventually got destroyed, but they started writing things all over the walls where it used to be, like drag power, gay power, legalized gay bars, all sorts of stuff like that. And like I said, every major news outlet was covering this, but the way that they were covering it was very unusual because actually publishing the word gay in the newspaper was illegal in a lot of areas. So they were obviously putting a lot of the blame on the protesters, similar to situations we saw with the civil rights movement. And so some groups decided, like, we need to have our own newspaper. Like, we need gay newspapers, and we need to distribute information immediately about what really happened at Stonewall. So they formed their own newspapers, form more groups, start planning protests and marches, and that's really what kicks things off. So we would consider Stonewall to be the tipping point of the gay lib movement, and lots of things are going to happen over the next decade or so. Probably the most powerful gay lib group during this movement is going to be called the Gay Liberation Front. They were the first organization to use the word gay in their name. And this is a group that really connects both coasts. We really see the East Coast and West Coast start to be like two different movements during this. But they link up with, they worked well with both sides of the country. They start chapters all over the place, and they use a lot of their connections to the women's movement and to the civil rights movement to move forward. We'll officially start hosting Pride in June of 1970 as the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riot, and it's continued every year since. Some other publications you should know would be the first newspaper to use the word gay was called Gay, and it was a newspaper published in Greenwich Village, the same neighborhood where Stonewall was. And then also a student-run newspaper called The Empty Closet. There really wasn't a presence like of a gay liberation movement on a lot of college campuses, even though we're going to see college campuses becoming really like the forefront of change in a lot of different areas, but there was so much stigma and so much fear that a lot of people, you feel way more comfortable joining a women's group because you are a woman, but if you join a gay lib group, like, your entire world could come crashing down around you. So calling it The Empty Closet is obvious, right? Like, the closet is empty because they came out of the closet. And it's going to be one of the first publications to like promote materials for the gay community on a college campus and try to get that college group side going. In the 1970s, we're going to see lots of gay people moving to the cities, especially on the West Coast. We call this the gay migration. San Francisco certainly saw the largest, and that brought us Harvey Milk, which was like one of the first pro-gay rights politicians and the first like openly gay elected official. He serves in San Francisco as a city supervisor. He even passed a gay rights ordinance in the city, which attracted even more people. Unfortunately, in 1978, he was assassinated by a coworker, and that sparked riots and more conversations. Eventually, the first national gay rights march is going to happen in 1979 with over 100,000 participants. As far as change goes, really the only real significant change we're going to see during these early years of the movement were really about consciousness raising. The civil rights movement didn't need to have consciousness raising because their movement has been going on since slavery, right? The movement for change for African Americans has been ever evolving, but this is the first time there's really been a major movement like this for the LGBT community. So having a time of consciousness raising is going to be important. However, though, we will start to see states legalize or decriminalize being gay. In 1962, Illinois was the first state to do it, and then, like I said, it'll continue on a state-by-state basis after that. All right, on to the second wave of feminism. So the first wave, if you remember, was all our suffragettes pushing for the 19th Amendment in 1920. And since then, if you remember when we were talking about Alice Paul, after the 19th Amendment was passed, Alice Paul wrote a new amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which would basically put in a constitutional amendment guaranteeing equal treatment regardless of sex. Well, during the war, during World War II, we saw so much change for women. There was so much opportunity for women to have jobs and take on a larger role in society and all these other things. But when the war was over, it was like, okay, now that's done. That was just temporary, right? Go back home, get back to, our traditional gender roles, get back in the kitchen, start popping out babies. You don't need a career, girl. All these other things started happening again. And I believe had it not been for World War II, there probably wouldn't have been this opportunity for women to be like, hey, that actually sucks. And I know it sucks now because I've seen what it could be, and I've seen the road that we could be on, and this isn't the road that I'm gonna choose. I want to get back to where we were before. And we really would consider this second wave to start with the book The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which we already talked about, who was part of that Beat generation of authors, who was talking about the negative consequences of pushing those conformist stereotypes and traditional gender roles on women, and how that can affect their mental health and things like that. So we're going to see after the feminine mystique becomes so popular throughout the 1960s and 70s, we're going to see this new rise of a women's liberation movement, the same way we're going to see all these other movements. The first major event would probably be in 1960 when the FDA approves the first oral contraceptive pill, which was called Enovid. It'll take a couple of years to really be popular on the market, but thousands, hundreds of thousands of women are going to be taking this pill, which is good in terms of women's independence, bad because a lot of doctors weren't telling women about these side effects, so we're going to see a lot of negative consequences that women were not expecting or were not informed about. That same year, Kennedy is going to form the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, I guess the following year, when he was officially in office. But it's going to be chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and they did this huge investigation into discrimination against women and where is it? Where do we find discrimination against women? And ultimately, what do they find? They find it everywhere. So, in every area of life, in education, in athletics, in healthcare, and the workplace, all over the place, there's discrimination against women in every capacity. So women start putting together sort of a unified movement. That's when the Feminine Mystique is published in 1963, and the Equal Pay Act is passed that same year. Definitely one of the biggest goals of the movement was equality in the workplace. That's probably, if not the biggest unified goal that the movement had. Not only to get equal hiring, but to get equal pay and things like that. When the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, it did not apply to most corporate jobs. Most white-collar jobs did not fall under the Equal Pay Act. Nothing in office administration or any type of professional job, whether it be like doctor, lawyer, teacher, like nothing really that required a degree fell under the Equal Pay Act. So that inspired a lot of women to move forward and say, hey, like we need real congressional change. We need someone to lobby for us in Congress. And so Betty Friedan and some other women decide that they need a group specifically for that. So they form a group called the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which was dedicated to true equality for all women. And their major goal was to pass the ERA, but not only that, but to, work for reproductive rights, work for equality in the workforce. But the strategy there was that they were going to lobby in Congress. They were going to work with legislators to try to get change there. And then we're just going to see the ball rolling, and it's going to be like change after change after change. And this was definitely the year of the woman, the decade of women. This is where we're going to see like a heightened time of social change. We know not only for women, but definitely for women. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, to ban segregation, that also provided equal hiring and fair hiring of jobs. Title VII in that included women. And so we're going to see more of more progress on that front of getting women equal access to jobs. A few Supreme Court cases you should know. Griswold v. Connecticut is one, which allowed all married women access to oral contraceptives. If you're thinking that they got that back in the 1920s, no. In the 1920s with Margaret Sanger, remember, she just got doctors the ability to send out information about contraceptives, but it didn't necessarily guarantee all married women the right to that. There were still some states that were restricting who can have access to birth control. But the case Griswold v. Connecticut gives all married women access to contraceptives. And then a few years later in the 1970s, the case Eisenstadt v. Baird will give all women access to contraceptives. So we won't see all women having equal access to birth control until the 1970s. Probably one of the most outspoken and well-known activists and faces of the second wave is this woman right here. Her name is Gloria Steinem, and she was gorgeous, one, but two, she was a writer and a journalist, a freelance writer, and she decided to, for one of her series, she was going to go undercover in a Playboy club as a Playboy bunny. She got a job, which wasn't hard for her because she definitely looked the part. And she wrote all about how she was treated by the business and how she was treated by customers, what she was expected to do. And the Playboy Club definitely was not a strip club. It was just like a regular club. But you could consider something like this sort of to be sex work, or definitely like close to that genre of job. And we had never really heard how women were treated in these capacities before. Like, I'm sure everyone can imagine it wasn't good. But to hear someone firsthand talk about how what they were pressured to do with clients, how clients were allowed to speak to them, how clients were allowed to touch them, what they were expected, they were weighed every day. They weren't allowed to gain any weight. Their diets were controlled by the business. They had to have their hair, makeup, nails done at all times, like all these things. And she published these articles called A Bunny's Tale. And it really showed how it, in every aspect of life, like, we've got women who are being objectified and degraded, and was more of that consciousness raising. In 1972, she's going to start her own magazine called Miss Magazine, and she's going to be one of the most vocal and aggressive supporters for the ERA. And all through the 1970s, that was really the main mission, was to get the ERA passed. In 1971, they host like a big women's equality day. In 1973, it's the first time they're going to use the word sexual harassment in a report on gender issues. So we're really starting to have more conversations and about issues aside from we're not getting equal pay. There are starting to be more conversations about violence against women and issues that women are facing that these other social change groups might not have to be worried about. And that was one of the things that they thought the ERA would really start to, sorry, I'm moving slides on accident. It's one of the things that they really thought that the ERA would fix. And so definitely the most vocal opponent of the ERA is this woman over here on the far left with that stop sign on her chest. Her name is Phyllis Schlafly, who represents like the conservative side, not of the women's movement. She definitely would not consider herself to be a women's liber or feminist by any means. She claimed that feminism was an assault on the family, marriage, children, and most of her arguments and the arguments of her peers were the ones that we saw people making against suffrage, honestly. When they said suffrage would ruin the family, she says the ERA would ruin the family. When they said suffrage would cause women to have to get drafted, Phyllis said that the ERA would have to cause women to get drafted. Unfortunately, the ERA, while it did pass Congress, when it was up for state ratification, it did fail one state short of getting officially becoming a constitutional amendment. But aside from falling short of the ERA, there was still so much other positive change. Title IX brought, guaranteed equality in education. Roe v. Wade in 1970 guaranteed women access to an abortion in their first trimester, and the second trimester was up to the state. So we're starting to definitely see a lot of progress, and this obviously won't be the last wave, but this is arguably probably one of the most successful waves of feminism that we will see. Now, aside from the ladies, some other smaller movements that you might not have heard of before that were still just as active as these other groups, we'll start with the Chicano movement. Chicano is essentially Mexican Americans. And the name Chicano was originally an insult, so the movement was trying to take it back by label themselves after that. And Chicano is similar to Black Power. It's definitely meant to empower the Mexican American community, fight against stereotypes. They wanted farm workers' rights, enhanced education, voting and political rights, restoration of land grants, and it was also about raising awareness of police brutality in communities where, in like more urban communities that had a large Chicano population, like East Los Angeles. So a few people who you should know as leaders of the movement. The first is a guy named Corky Gonzalez, who is a poet and organized the first ever youth conference for the Chicano movement. And he published a poem called Yo Soy Joaquin, which, means I am Joaquin. And basically in that poem, he's like defining what it means to be a Chicano and the duality of his identity of having this Spanish history, but having this native Mexican history and being in a white dominated world in the United States, and how all those things blend together to create his world and his identity. And people lived for it. It became sort of like the anthem of the Chicano movement, and people would chant "Yo soy Joaquin" at organized marches or protests or things like that. The second major leader that you should know is Cesar Chavez, and this is him right over here. And he was working for farmers' rights. He united farm workers as well as struggling urban youth, and formed a group called the National Farm Workers Association, and made the struggle of farm workers a moral one. If you remember from the Bracero program, how terribly so many of those workers were treated, and even though the Bracero program by this time is over, it does end in 1964 with the help of Chavez and this movement. There were still plenty of areas where farm workers, especially Chicano farm workers, were treated terribly. So they continued to work for change for those farm workers and better treatment. I'm sure you've heard his slogan before, which is "Si se puede," which means yes, we can. So don't think that was, an original Obama. That's a slogan that's been around for a really long time, but it definitely, majority of the credit goes here to Chavez, who sort of coined that phrase. The main group that you should know for the Chicano movement is called MALDEF, MALDEF, which stands for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, which was kind of like the NAACP, but for Mexican Americans, but they also did activism as well. They were founded in 1968, and they're still an active group today. They work then and now on voting rights, employment, education, the rights of undocumented workers, anything like that. Women in the movement definitely had their own things going on. The Chicana movement was even like a movement within the Chicano movement, because even within the Mexican American community, many women felt like that movement was leaving women out, and that it was very much like this macho movement that even within the Mexican community, there was a lot of pressure of stereotypes and enforcing traditional gender roles of like Mexican women should stay at home and raise children and all this other stuff. And so women decide, well, we need our own movement within this, because this isn't something we want. And they'll start to raise their own issues. Probably the biggest issue that they will tackle is the illegal forced sterilization of Mexican women. And this wasn't something that was just happening to Mexican women. This was happening to Black women. This was happening to Asian women. Birth control exists, but it's only marketed to the middle class. And a lot of immigrant families were seen as like from a upper level perspective to be like an economic drain on society. So thousands of women were sterilized at doctors' offices or hospitals without their consent, because they would be told one thing and then given a medical consent form in English that they couldn't read, and then would have this done to them. And so finally the Supreme Court passed a case that said which was Madrigal v. Quilligan, which said that all medical consent forms had to be given in your native tongue, which was definitely a huge moment in a positive direction for Mexican women, and really for all women of color. But probably the most famous protest hosted by the Mexican American movement, by this Chicano movement, is actually going to be the Chicano blowouts, which were in 1968 in Los Angeles. These were student walkouts, walking out in high schools all over LA to protest high dropout rates and the lack of funding to so many of their schools. They wanted bilingual education. They wanted a new curriculum that included their heritage. They wanted some of their school administrators to be of Mexican descent. They wanted teachers with high dropout rates to be evaluated. They wanted a new arts program. They wanted new schools to prevent overcrowding and to expand libraries. Unfortunately, the blowouts were not super successful, but it definitely inspired other movements and gave more young people within the movement like the opportunity to have their voices heard, which was a big one. And we'll see art as a big piece of the Chicano movement as well, especially like murals, and a lot of their paintings were really similar to the paintings we saw in the Harlem Renaissance. You can see like this painting up here in the top with all these bright colors. A lot of what we see is the blending of cultures, of American modern cultures and more traditional or ancient Mexican cultures, like even Aztec. Lots of bright colors. Like I said, lots of murals and stuff, and really trying to push for not only political activism but also the cultural pride at the same time. So, in addition to the Chicano movement, we'll also see the American Indian movement. We know how Native Americans have been treated in the United States, long before this moment. So, it's kind of like about time that they would seize the moment and have their own movement as well. And so there's actually a group called the American Indian Movement that we would consider to be sort of like the leader and the kickoff of all of this. In July of 1968, they formed in Minneapolis and coined the phrase Red Power and wanted to create real economic independence for Native Americans in the United States. And they will inspire other groups to form, like the Indians of all tribes and other organizations. Some important protests that you should know. Probably the first main one was the occupation of Alcatraz, the prison, where they took over the prison and used the Treaty of Fort Laramie from 1868 to try to gain control of abandoned federal land back. The entire occupation lasted 19 months, and was the first major protest by an American Indian group to gain like national attention, which inspired and allowed for the progress of other major protests. And probably the only other one that would be on that scale would be the Trail of Broken Treaties, which was a march essentially to DC in October of 1972, where they stormed the offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was known for being corrupt and not actually helping Native American people at all. And they were successful. They got the government to abandoned the Bureau of Indian Affairs and started an investigation and increased funding for programs that were going to help the Native American community. And it definitely did do a lot of good. And last is the Asian American movement. This is different from some of these other movements because the Native American movement is obviously just about people who are racially Native American. The Chicano movement is just about Mexican Americans. But saying Asian American, how many countries are in Asia? So this movement is definitely one that focuses on cooperation, and it's certainly a pan-Asian movement. It's not just about people who are Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese or Cambodian or any of that stuff. It was very much inclusive and very heavily influenced by the Black Power movement and some of these other works of the civil rights movement. Probably the most well-known group and active group during their movement was the Asian American Political Alliance, which was very much influenced by the Black Power movement, like I said, and they worked with other groups to start student strikes. They worked with a group called the Third World Liberation Front, which held the largest student strikes in history and successfully were able to convince colleges like University of California at Berkeley to rewrite their curriculums to include histories and current events that affect not only the Asian American population but other groups as well. Now, the last movement I want to talk about is not a racial movement or an ethnic movement. It's actually the environmental movement. This is a movement of an issue similar to the anti-war movement that we'll talk about later. But after World War II, people became more aware of the wilderness and conservation, and a lot of that was due to nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing. We were starting to have conversations about, what did these chemicals do to land, water, people, animals? Like what's the effects of all of this? And we would consider the start of the movement to come with the publication of a book called Silent Spring by a woman named Rachel Carson. And the book was about the effects of chemicals on our environment, especially pesticides, and specifically the effect of these chemicals on birds. And that's why it was called Silent Spring, trying to say that one day we would wake up, it would be spring, but it would be quiet because there would be no new, like, baby birds chirping or anything. Her book was extremely influential and sparked this massive protest movement. In 1970, we're going to see the first Earth Day demonstrations, and Nixon, who was president at the time, will actually really support a lot of these changes. After a few major environmental issues, we'll start to see some serious legislation. Two issues you should know. The first was the Love Canal incident, which was Love Canal, New York, in upstate New York. Companies had been dumping toxic and harmful chemicals into the canal, and the residents of the community had been experiencing disease and birth defects for years because of that contamination. And it ended up being so bad that they had to completely evacuate the community and, basically shut the whole area down because the water and the ground was so badly contaminated that people just couldn't live there anymore because of the effects of that toxic waste. And the other was the situation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, at a nuclear energy plant called 3 Mile Island. And the plant almost melted down, which essentially means that it almost began leaking radiation, like from the plant. And the governor of Pennsylvania had to declare a state of emergency, shut the entire plant down. To this day, you cannot go to 3 Mile Island because it's not safe. It's not operating anymore, and it's under a lot, very heavy surveillance. But these issues really started a lot of people talking about what are we doing to the planet, and then what are going to be the effects for us in the long run. So in 1970, we're going to create the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, which is going to be in charge of putting in place and executing a lot of these laws that we're going to have that are going to protect the environment. Same year, we passed the Clean Air Act, which puts caps on chemical emissions that can be put out into the air, and pollutants and things like that. 1972, the Water Pollution Control Act, similar to Clean Air, but now about what you can and can't dump in the water. And then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, which will work to protect our animals and officially establish the endangered species list.